Welcome to part 4 of our series Explaining Genesis, where we will be exploring the genealogy from Adam to Noah and the world before the Great Flood. Each passage is explored through its historical context, a literal breakdown of the Hebrew text, and the deeper spiritual meaning behind the narrative. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And he named them mankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. Historical context. The opening of Genesis chapter 5 introduces a major shift in the literary structure of the book. The phrase, "This is the written account of Adam's family line," uses the Hebrew word toledot, which is the foundational building block of the entire book of Genesis. In the ancient Near East of the 15th century before Christ, a toledot was more than a list. It was a formal tablet of origins, or a history of generations. Historically, these documents served as the legal and social backbone of a tribe. By transitioning from the story of Cain's line in the previous chapter to the toledot of Adam in chapter 5, the author is signaling a formal reset. While Cain's line was focused on cities and metallurgy, this line is focused on the preservation of the divine image. For an ancient audience, this was the moment where the official record of the chosen lineage began, establishing a direct link between the Creator and the ancestors of the Israelite people. The repetition of the creation language in Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, specifically the mention of the likeness of God and the creation of male and female, is a crucial historical callback. In the surrounding cultures of Mesopotamia, humans were often viewed as a collective workforce created to serve the physical needs of the gods. There was very little emphasis on the individual dignity of a human being outside of the king. By re-emphasizing that all of mankind, both male and female, carries the divine likeness, Genesis is making a radical historical claim. It asserts that despite the fall and the violence of the previous chapter, the essential blueprint of humanity has not been erased. This would have provided a powerful sense of identity for the Israelites, who were living in a world where human life was often treated as cheap or expendable by the great empires. The mention of Adam fathering a son in his own likeness and in his own image in Genesis chapter 4 verse 3 is a detail with significant historical and legal implications. In the ancient world, the image of a king was placed in a conquered territory to represent his presence and authority. When a son was born, he was seen as the physical and legal extension of his father's image. Historically, this verse confirms that the image of God was not just a one-time event for the first man, but a transmissible quality passed down from generation to generation. It establishes Seth as the legitimate heir to the mission given to Adam in Eden. For the first audience, this was a vital historical bridge, showing that the promise of a future deliverer would flow through this specific biological line. The extraordinary lifespans mentioned in this block, such as Adam living 930 years, are the most debated historical aspects of the chapter. To understand this, we have to look at the Sumerian king list, which records pre-flood kings reigning for tens of thousands of years. In the historical mindset of the ancient Near East, high numbers were a way of signaling the greatness, vitality, and purity of a particular era. While the biblical numbers are much lower than the Sumerian ones, they are still far higher than modern lifespans. Historically, this suggests that the ancient world viewed the period before the flood as an age of biological giants, a time when the human life force was closer to its original source. It serves to emphasize that death, although now inevitable, was still a slow and encroaching reality that had not yet fully constricted the human experience. Finally, the concluding phrase of Genesis chapter 5, verse 5, "And then he died," serves as a grim historical punctuation mark. In the 15th century before Christ, death was the ultimate reality that defined every empire and every dynasty. Despite the massive lifespans and the preservation of the divine image, the sentence given in the garden, that humans are dust and to dust they shall return, is being historically fulfilled. This repetition of "and then he died" throughout the chapter functions like a funeral march. It reminds the audience that no matter how long a man lives or how many children he has, the enemy introduced in chapter 3 has not been defeated. This historical reality kept the focus of the Israelites on the future, looking for the offspring who would eventually break this cycle of mortality. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 1, the text begins with a formal title. This is the written account of Adam's family line. The Hebrew word for written account is Sefer Toledot. Sefer literally refers to a scroll or a book, and Toledot comes from a root meaning to bear or to beget. In the literary structure of Genesis, this is the first time we see a written record mentioned, suggesting a transition from oral tradition to a formalized archive. The verse repeats the language of the first chapter. See specifically that God made humanity in his likeness, or demet. This reinforces the literal fact that the core identity of humanity remains tied to the Creator, even after the fall. Genesis chapter 5, verse 2 emphasizes the binary nature of humanity. He created them, male and female. The Hebrew uses the words zakar and nekeba, which are biological terms. Interestingly, the text says God named them mankind, or Adam, when they were created. This is a literal indication that the name Adam functions as both a proper noun for the first man and a collective noun for the entire human race. The act of blessing them, or barak, signifies that the original mandate of fruitfulness is still in effect. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, we see a crucial linguistic development. It says Adam had a son in his own likeness and in his own image, and he named him Seth. The words used here, demut and selim, are the exact same words used to describe God's creation of man in chapter 1. Literally, this shows that the image of God is now being transmitted through human procreation. While Seth is the son of Adam, he still carries the divine blueprint. The age of Adam at this birth is recorded as 130 years, establishing the chronological anchor for the rest of the chapter. Genesis chapter 5, verses 4 and 5, provide the closing formula for Adam's life. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. This implies a massive expansion of the human population that is not detailed in the text. The finality of the block is found in verse 5. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. The Hebrew verb for died is vayamot. This is the first time this word is applied to a primary figure in a genealogy. It provides the literal fulfillment of the warning in Genesis chapter 2, proving that while Adam's life was long, his mortality was absolute. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual weight of Genesis chapter 5 verse 1 is found in the persistence of human dignity. By opening this new record with a reminder of the likeness of God, the text is declaring that sin did not erase the divine image. Spiritually, this teaches us that our value is not based on our performance or our history, but on our origin. Even in a world that had already seen murder and exile, God still views humanity through the lens of their original creation. This provides a spiritual foundation for the sanctity of life that continues throughout the rest of the Bible. Genesis chapter 5 verse 2 carries a spiritual message about the unity and diversity of the human race. By stating that God named them Adam, or mankind, the text suggests a spiritual solidarity. Regardless of gender or individual identity, all humans share a single name and a single blessing from the Creator. This teaches us that there is a spiritual equality at the core of human existence. The blessing of God is not a reward for good behavior, but a divine gift given at the moment of creation to sustain the human story. The spiritual significance of Genesis chapter 5 verse 3 lies in the transmission of the image. When Seth is born in Adam's likeness, it highlights a spiritual paradox. We are born into the brokenness of our earthly fathers, yet we still carry the image of our heavenly Father. Seth represents a spiritual restart. While Cain was the son of acquisition, Seth is the son of the image. This teaches us that God's plan for humanity is not derailed by individual failures. The divine image is durable enough to survive the fall and be passed down through the generations. Finally, the spiritual refrain in Genesis chapter 5 verse 5, "And then he died," serves as a sobering reminder of the reality of the fall. No amount of years, no matter how great the number, can bypass the spiritual law of mortality. Adam's 930 years represent the peak of human vitality, but even that vitality eventually returns to the dust. Spiritually, this refrain functions like a tolling bell. It forces the reader to look beyond the long lifespans of the patriarchs and recognize the need for a solution to death. It creates a spiritual tension that can only be resolved by the promise of the offspring, who will one day overcome the grave. Genesis chapter 5, verses 6 through 11. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enoch. After he became the father of Enoch, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. When Enoch had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. After he became the father of Kenan, Enoch lived 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 905 years, and then he died. Historical context. The historical transition from Seth to Enoch to Kenan marks the solidification of the first post-Edenic civilization that was distinct from the line of Cain. In the 15th century before Christ, being the lineage of a person was their primary credential. For the ancient Israelites, Seth was not just a name, he was the foundation of the sacred line, the first generation born to Adam and Eve after the fall and the murder of Abel. Historically, this period represents the establishment of what historians often call the patriarchate. The long lives recorded here served a specific historical function. They allowed for an overlap of generations that ensured oral traditions, laws, and the knowledge of the Creator were passed down with a high degree of fidelity. If Adam lived for 930 years, he would have been a contemporary of every patriarch in this list up until Lamech, the father of Noah. This overlap provided a historical continuity that was unheard of in later eras. The birth of Enoch in Genesis chapter 5 verse 6 carries immense historical weight because of what his name represents. In the Semitic languages of the ancient Near East, Enoch is a word for man, but it specifically emphasizes human frailty and mortality. While the line of Cain was naming their children after beauty and technological mastery, the line of Seth chose a name that acknowledged the inherent weakness of the human condition. Historically, this suggests that the second generation of the Sethite line was characterized by a humble recognition of their own mortality. This was a period where, as the previous chapter noted, people began to call on the name of the Lord. The historical context is one of spiritual awakening, born out of the realization that human life, though long, was ultimately fragile. In a world that was becoming increasingly violent and self-reliant, the Enoch generation was the historical anchor for a community that looked to the divine rather than the sword. When we reach Canaan in Genesis chapter 5 verse 9, we see the third generation of this lineage. The name Canaan is historically interesting because it is linguistically related to the word for a nest or a fixed place. It also shares a root with the word for a smith or a craftsman. This suggests that by the time of the third generation, the line of Seth was no longer just a small family unit, but was beginning to settle and build a more permanent social structure. Historically, this mirrors the transition from a purely nomadic lifestyle to a semi-settled existence. While Cain built the first city, Canaan represents the Sethite response, a community that was creating a nest or a place of dwelling that remained centered on the worship of Yahweh. The historical record shows a civilization that was growing in numbers and stability, yet maintaining its distinct spiritual identity through its names and its commitment to the legacy of the image of God. The ages recorded for Seth and Enoch, 912 and 905 years respectively, fit into a wider historical tradition of ancient wisdom. In the ancient world, age was synonymous with authority and divine favor. The fact that these patriarchs lived through 9 centuries would have made them the ultimate historical witnesses. They were the living libraries of the human race. In the context of the 15th century before Christ, where the Israelites were being called to remember their origins, but the long lives of these fathers served as proof that the promise of God was being sustained through time. The repetitive formula of their lives, living, fathering, and dying, created a historical rhythm. It was a cycle of life that was robust enough to resist the encroaching darkness of the age. Every new father represented a historical victory over the death that had been introduced in the garden, showing that the line of the woman was continuing just as God had promised. Finally, the historical reality of the end of each block, the phrase, "and then he died," cannot be overlooked. In the ancient Near East, where death was often explained through complex mythologies of warring gods, Genesis provides a stark, historical simplicity. Death was the consequence of a broken covenant. Despite the massive vitality and the long ages of Seth and Enoch, they were not immortal. Historically, this functioned as a warning to the Israelites. It showed that even the greatest and longest-lived ancestors were subject to the judgment of God. This created a historical tension between the blessing of life and the certainty of judgment. The line of Seth was a community of the living who were constantly being reminded of their mortality, a reality that kept their spiritual focus on the need for a savior who could eventually conquer the grave. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 6, the record continues with the next generation of the appointed line. Seth, at the age of 105, became the father of Enoch. The Hebrew verb used for becoming a father is yalad. This is a causative verb that emphasizes the direct biological link between the generations. It is the literal heartbeat of the genealogy, proving that the promised seed was moving forward through a physical, verifiable line of descent. Seth's remaining years are listed as 807, during which he had other sons and daughters. This literal detail is often overlooked, but it indicates that the family trees we see in the Bible are only the trunk of a much larger human forest. The population was expanding exponentially during this 900-year period. Genesis chapter 5, verse 8 concludes the account of Seth with the phrase, "Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died." The Hebrew for "and then he died" is veyamot. This is a single, sharp word that rings through the entire chapter. No matter how many sons and daughters were born, the literal end for every patriarch is this word. Seth's life, while nearly a millennium long, was still bounded by the physical laws of decay established in the 3rd chapter. This creates a literal rhythm of biological success, followed by inevitable mortality. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 9, the focus shifts to Enoch. At the age of 90, he became the father of Kenan. The name Enoch comes from the Hebrew word Enoch, which refers to a human being in their state of weakness or mortality. Literally, this is a distinct word from Adam, which refers to humanity in their representative or created glory. By naming his son Enoch, Seth was literally encoding the reality of human frailty into the family record. The genealogy records that Enoch lived 815 more years. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 11, we see the total, 905 years. He too reached the point of veyamot. Kenan, the son of Enoch, is introduced in Genesis chapter 5, verse 12. His name in Hebrew is Canaan. This name is linguistically complex because it shares a root with the word for a nest or a fixed dwelling place, but it can also relate to the word for a metalworker or smith. This provides a literal linguistic parallel to the name Cain. While Cain was the first to build a city, Canaan represents the first in the line of Seth to be described with a name suggesting settlement or fixed possession. The age of his fatherhood is 70, the youngest recorded so far in the list. This marks a literal acceleration in the timeline as the population begins to spread across the earth. The literal structure of these verses is a perfect repetition. Age of fatherhood, name of son, remaining years, other children, total years, and death. This repetitive formula serves as a literal witness to the consistency of God's laws. The blessing of fruitfulness is being fulfilled at a precise, rhythmic pace. At the same time, the curse of death is being executed with the same terrifying consistency. The text uses these numbers to build a literal bridge of time, showing exactly how long the original knowledge of the garden was preserved by living witnesses. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual meaning of Genesis chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, centers on the endurance of the appointed life. Seth's name means appointed, and his long life of 912 years is a spiritual testament to God's commitment to sustaining the line of faith. Even though the world was becoming increasingly secular and violent through the line of Cain, the line of Seth remained spiritually stable. This teaches us that the life God appoints for us is designed to outlast the pressures of the culture around us. Seth's life is a spiritual anchor, showing that a life lived in alignment with God's purpose has a spiritual weight that transcends time. The birth of Enoch in Genesis chapter 5 verse 9 carries the spiritual lesson of humility. As noted in the previous chapter, it was during the time of Enoch that people began to call on the name of the Lord. The spiritual connection is clear. When we acknowledge that we are Enoch, frail and mortal, we are finally in a position to seek God. The spiritual life does not begin with our strength, but with the honest admission of our weakness. Enoch represents the generation that stopped trying to be gods and started learning to be worshippers. This teaches us that our greatest spiritual breakthrough happens when we stop building our own cities and start calling on His name. Canan's place in the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 verse 12 offers a spiritual perspective on settling in the world. If his name refers to a nest or a dwelling, it suggests that the community of faith was beginning to find its place on the earth. Spiritually, this is a delicate balance. We are called to be in the world, but not of it. Canan's name reminds us that even when we build a nest for our families and our work, our primary identity must remain rooted in the line of Seth. This teaches us that the material progress of our lives must always be subservient to the spiritual heritage we are passing down to the next generation. The recurring refrain, "And then he died," right in Genesis chapter 5 verses 8 and 11, is the most powerful spiritual sermon in the passage. It is the sound of the clock of judgment. Even for these supermen who lived for 9 centuries, death was the final word. This teaches us the spiritual gravity of sin. It reminds us that no amount of human vitality can solve the problem of the fall. The spiritual life requires a hope that goes beyond long years and healthy families. The repetitive nature of death in this chapter creates a spiritual hunger for the one who would eventually come to break the power of the grave. Finally, the mention of other sons and daughters in every generation reminds us of the spiritual unseen. While the Bible focuses on the specific line leading to Noah, it acknowledges that a massive spiritual battle was taking place among the thousands of others born in these centuries. Spiritually, this teaches us that every generation is a mission field. The line of Seth was not just preserving a genealogy, they were preserving a light in a world that was rapidly descending into darkness. The spiritual meaning of these generations is found in their quiet persistence. They lived, they fathered, and they died. But they did so while keeping the flame of the promise alive for a world they would never see. Genesis chapter 5, verses 12 through 17. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. After he became the father of Mahalalel, Canaan lived 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Canaan lived a total of 910 years, and then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he became the father of Jared. After he became the father of Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Mahalalel lived a total of 895 years, and then he died. Historical context. To understand the era of Mahalalel and Jared in Genesis chapter 5, we have to visualize the world of the 15th century before Christ and how ancient peoples understood the middle generations of their history. In any ancient Near Eastern genealogy, the generations between the founding father and the ultimate hero, in this case Noah, were not seen as mere filler. They were viewed as the era of settlement and expansion. For the Israelites, who were preparing to enter the land of Canaan, These verses provided a historical precedent for how a people maintains its spiritual identity over centuries of growth. Historically, this period represents the transition from a single family into a vast, sprawling population that was beginning to fill the earth as God had commanded. The naming of Mahalalel in Genesis chapter 5, verse 12, marks a critical historical moment in the development of Semitic religious identity. The name Mahalalel is composed of two Hebrew parts, Mahalal, meaning praise, and El, the shortened form of the word for God. Historically, this is one of the earliest examples of a theophoric name, a name that incorporates the name of a deity. In the 15th century before Christ, names were the primary way a family announced its allegiance, while the surrounding Mesopotamian cultures were increasingly naming their children after the gods of the sun or the storm. The line of Seth was embedding the concept of the praise of the true Creator directly into their biological record. This suggests a historical period where the community of faith was becoming more self-aware and intentional about its worship. They weren't just surviving, they were building a culture of celebration centered on the character of God. The transition to the generation of Jared in Genesis chapter 5, verse 15, introduces a historical shift that ancient Near Eastern traditions viewed with great solemnity. The name Jared comes from the root word Yered, which means descent or to come down. In the historical and pseudepigraphal traditions of the ancient Jews, which were deeply rooted in even older Near Eastern motifs, the days of Jared were believed to be the time when the spiritual boundary between heaven and earth began to erode. There was a historical sense in the ancient world that as humanity moved further away from the time of Adam, there was a literal descent in moral and spiritual quality. While the line of Cain was building its cities in the east, the line of Seth in the days of Jared was historically witnessing the increasing pressure of a world that was becoming more complex and simultaneously more corrupted. Historically, the lifespans of 910 years for Kenan and 895 years for Mahalalel served as the chronological backbone of the early world. In the 15th century before Christ, the authority of a tradition was tied to the age and endurance of its witnesses. Because these men lived for nearly a millennium, they acted as the living repositories of the history of Eden. Historically, this meant that the stories of the garden, the fall, and the promise of the woman's offspring were not distant myths, but eyewitness accounts. A man born in the generation of Jared could still sit at the feet of Adam or Seth. This created a historical environment where the original truth was physically present and accessible. It gave the line of Seth a historical stability that stood in sharp contrast to the rapidly changing and often chaotic cultures of the surrounding pagan nations. The mention of other sons and daughters in Genesis chapter 5 verses 13 and 16 points to the historical reality of the first population explosion. During the 900 years of Mahalalel's life, the human race was no longer a small group of siblings. Historically, this was the era of the first Great Migration. As the land around the original settlements became crowded, families would have moved further out, establishing new territories. For an ancient audience, this was a period of both wonder and danger. With expansion came the breakdown of close-knit family accountability. The descent implied by Jared's name may historically reflect the difficulty of maintaining the pure worship of Yahweh as the population spread and encountered the growing influence of the Canaanite civilization. It represents the historical struggle to keep the praise of God alive in an expanding and increasingly fractured world. Finally, the repetitive ending, "and then he died," functions as a historical reality check, even in the generation named for praise and the generation named for descent. The consequence of the fall remained the dominant historical force. In the ancient world, many myths suggested that the earliest humans were semi-divine and therefore immortal. Genesis historically corrects this by showing that even the greatest of the patriarchs were subject to the dust. For the Israelites, this was a crucial lesson. History is not a story of human progress toward godhood, but a story of human mortality in need of divine intervention. The steady march of deaths in this chapter created a historical drumbeat that pointed toward the necessity of the flood, a reset of a history that was slowly descending into the grave. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 12, the focus shifts to the third generation of the Sethite line. Kenan, at age 70, became the father of Mahalalel. The name Canaan in Hebrew is Canaan, which is linguistically linked to the concept of a fixed place or a nest. This represents a literal phase of human history, where the population was moving from nomadic existence to settled communities. At 70, Kenan is the youngest father in the record so far, indicating a literal acceleration in the reproductive cycle of the early world. After fathering Mahalalel, he lived another 840 years, reaching a total of 910. The text remains brutally consistent with the closing formula. Altogether, he lived his total years, and then he died. The word for died is vayamot, which functions as a literal seal on his historical record. Genesis chapter 4, verse 15 introduces Mahalalel. His name is a compound of the Hebrew words Mahalal, meaning praise, and El, meaning God. Literarily, this is a significant marker because it is the first name in this lineage that explicitly incorporates the name of the Creator. This indicates that the line of Seth was literally embedding their theology into their identity. At age 65, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel's total life was 895 years. He is the first patriarch in this specific list whose lifespan falls below the 900-year mark, creating a literal, albeit subtle, downward trend in the longevity of the antediluvian fathers. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 18, the genealogy records the birth of Jared's son. Jared's name in Hebrew is Yered, which comes from the root yared, meaning to descend or to go down. He was 162 years old when he fathered Enoch. This is a much later start to fatherhood compared to the previous 3 generations, which may literally reflect a shift in the biological or social conditions of the time. Jared's total life of 962 years makes him the second oldest man in the Bible, and second only to his grandson Methuselah. Despite his massive vitality, his record ends with the same literal finality. He had other sons and daughters, and then he died. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual weight of Mahalalel's generation is found in the power of public identity. By naming a son praise of God, the community of faith was making a spiritual declaration, while the world of Cain was naming children after ornaments and shadows. The line of Seth was focusing on the glory of the Creator. Spiritually, this teaches us that our names, the things we are known for, should act as a compass for our souls. Mahalalel serves as a spiritual reminder that worship is not just an activity we do, but an identity we carry. In a time of rapid human expansion, his name kept the focus on the source of all life. The generation of Jared introduces a more somber spiritual lesson regarding the direction of a culture. His name, descent, suggests a spiritual gravity that pulls downward. As humanity moved further away from the memory of Eden, the struggle to maintain the heights of holiness became more difficult. This teaches us that spiritual decline is often a slow, intergenerational process. It is a descent that happens one decision at a time. Jared's long life shows that God's grace remains present even in a descending culture. But the name itself functions as a spiritual warning that we must actively resist the pull of the world if we wish to stay connected to the heavens. The spiritual significance of the other sons and daughters mentioned in these verses cannot be ignored. While the text tracks the specific line of the promise, it acknowledges a vast, growing world in the background. Spiritually, this reminds us that God is always working through a specific remnant to preserve the truth for the benefit of the whole. The line of Canaan, Mahalalel, and Jared was the narrow spiritual path through a world that was becoming increasingly crowded and complex. It teaches us that our individual faithfulness is the bridge that carries the promise of God from one age to the next. Finally, the spiritual refrain, "And then he died at the end of each life," serves as the ultimate reality check for the human ego. Whether a life is defined by praise or by dissent, it is still a life that must eventually face its creator. This teaches us that spiritual success is not measured by the length of our years, but by the quality of our walk. The steady rhythm of deaths in Genesis chapter 5 creates a spiritual hunger for someone who can break the cycle. It leaves us looking for a man who can walk through life without ending in the dust, preparing our hearts for the unique story of Enoch that follows. Genesis chapter 5, verses 18 through 24. When Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. After he became the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Jared lived a total of 962 years, and then he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. Historical context. The story of Enoch in Genesis chapter 5, verses 18 through 24, represents a dramatic historical disruption in the repetitive cycle of life and death that dominates this genealogy. In the 15th century before Christ, when the structure of a genealogy was often used to highlight a specific individual who reached a pinnacle of human experience. Enoch is the 7th generation from Adam, and in ancient Near Eastern culture, the number 7 symbolized completeness, perfection, and the climax of a sequence. Historically, the 7th person in a list was often the most significant. We see this pattern in the Sumerian king list, where the 7th king, Enmeduranki, is credited with receiving secret knowledge from the gods regarding divination and the sun. For the ancient Israelites, Enoch was the historical response to these pagan myths. He did not receive secret spells. He lived in a relationship with the Creator that was so intense it bypassed the primary consequence of the fall. The phrase Enoch walked faithfully with God has a very specific historical meaning in the ancient Near East. In the court culture of the 2nd millennium before Christ, to walk with a king meant to be a trusted advisor, a close friend, and a member of the royal inner circle. It implied a level of intimacy and loyalty that was reserved for the highest officials. Historically, by using this language, The author of Genesis is describing Enoch as a member of God's royal court. While other men in the genealogy were defined by their age or their offspring, Enoch was historically defined by his proximity to the King of the universe. This would have been a radical concept to the Israelites, suggesting that even in a world moving toward judgment, it was possible to maintain a private, royal fellowship with Yahweh. Enoch's lifespan of 365 years is one of the most intriguing historical details in the chapter. In the ancient world, the solar year was calculated at 365 days. The 15th century before Christ was a time when civilizations like Egypt and Babylon were obsessed with the movements of the sun and the stars to determine their calendars and their religious festivals. By assigning Enoch exactly 365 years, the text is historically linking him to the perfection of the solar cycle. It suggests that his life was a complete and perfect revolution in the light of God's presence. This detail served as a historical polemic against pagan sun worship. It showed that the sun was merely a reflection of the order established by God, and that a man who walked with the Creator achieved a level of wholeness that mirrored the heavens themselves. What is the historical conclusion of Enoch's life? That he was no more because God took him away is a complete break from the Vehemot. Or, and then he died, refrain that closes every other record. In the ancient world, there were rare stories of individuals being translated or snatched away by the gods to live in a separate realm. For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood hero Utnapishtim is granted immortality and taken by the gods to live at the mouth of the rivers. Historically, the account of Enoch gave the Israelites a distinct version of this hope. Enoch was not taken to a distant mythological land. He was taken into the presence of God. This established a historical precedent that death was not an inescapable finality for those in a covenant relationship with Yahweh. It provided a historical anchor for the belief that God had the power to rescue his image bearers from the dust. Finally, the contrast between Enoch and the seventh generation of Cain's line, Lamech, is a crucial historical theme. As noted previously, Lamech was defined by his pride, his polygamy, and his escalated violence. Enoch, his historical contemporary from the other line, represents the total opposite: humility, faithfulness, and divine acceptance. This historical dualism showed the Israelites that as the world grew older, the division between the two ways of being human was becoming absolute. There was a path that led to 77-fold vengeance, and a path that led to walking with God into eternity. Enoch served as the historical evidence that even in a culture of dissent, as indicated by his father Jared's name, as an individual could choose to ascend into the fellowship of the divine. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 18, we see the beginning of the generation that will break the cycle of the grave. Jared, at age 162, became the father of Enoch. The name Enoch in Hebrew is Chanokh, which comes from a root meaning to dedicate, to initiate, or to train. Literarily, this suggests that from his birth, Enoch was marked as someone set apart for a specific purpose. Jared lived a total of 962 years, making him the second longest lived human in the biblical record. But his life ends with the standard literal formula: and then he died. The literal shift occurs in Genesis chapter 5, verse 21. At age 65, Enoch fathered Methuselah. After this birth, the text deviates from the established pattern. Instead of simply saying he lived a certain number of years, Genesis chapter 5, verse 22 states that Enoch walked faithfully with God for 300 years. The Hebrew verb for walked is hithalek. This is the hitpail form of the verb, which denotes an intensive, habitual, and reflexive action. It implies a walking to and fro, or a life lived in constant motion with another. Significantly, this is the exact same word used in Genesis chapter 3 to describe God walking in the garden. Literally, the text is telling us that Enoch had found the path back to the intimate fellowship that Adam had abandoned. Genesis chapter 5, verse 23, records that altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Literally, this is a glaring departure from the 900-year lifespans of his ancestors and his son. The number 365 is a literal link to the solar year, signifying a full circle or a life that was complete in its duration, even if it was shorter in years. The climax of the literal breakdown is found in Genesis chapter 5, verse 24. It repeats that Enoch walked faithfully with God, but instead of the word vayamot, meaning and he died, the text says, then he was no more, because God took him away. The phrase he was no more is the Hebrew ve'enenu, which literally translates to, and he was not. It implies a sudden disappearance or an absence from the physical realm. The verb for took is lakash, which means to snatch, to seize, or to fetch. God did not watch Enoch die. He reached into the timeline and seized him. This is the first literal record of a human escaping the power of the dust since the curse was issued in the garden. Now, spiritual meaning. The spiritual message of Genesis chapter 5, verses 18 through 24, is the possibility of intimacy in the midst of a falling world. Enoch was born into the generation of Jared, which means descent. While the culture around him was sliding downward into violence and self-reliance, Enoch chose a path of spiritual ascent. This teaches us that our spiritual environment does not have to determine our spiritual destination. We are not victims of the descent of our age. We have the agency to walk in the opposite direction. Enoch's life is a spiritual proof that the way back to God is not a geographic location like Eden, but a relational posture of the heart. The spiritual timing of Enoch's walk is also significant. The text notes that he walked with God after he became the father of Methuselah. This suggests that the responsibilities of fatherhood and the reality of passing on a legacy may have been the spiritual catalyst for his deeper devotion. This teaches us that the everyday duties of life, raising children, working, and maintaining a home, are not distractions from a spiritual walk. They are the very ground upon which that walk is tested and proven. True spirituality is not found in fleeing from the world, but in walking with God through the middle of it. The intensive nature of the word hithalek provides a spiritual lesson on consistency. Enoch did not have a one-time encounter with the divine. He had a 300-year conversation. This teaches us that God is looking for steady, habitual faithfulness, rather than emotional outbursts of piety. To walk with God is to synchronize your pace with His. It means moving when He moves, and stopping when He stops. Enoch's spiritual success was found in the fact that he stayed in step with the Creator for 3 centuries, regardless of the changing seasons of his life or the increasing darkness of the world around him. The spiritual conclusion of Enoch's life, his translation into the presence of God, is the ultimate answer to the "and then he died" refrain of the rest of the chapter. Enoch is the spiritual first fruits of the victory over death. He represents the hope that the dust-to-dust sentence of Genesis chapter 3 is not the final word for humanity, By taking Enoch, God was providing a spiritual sign to the antediluvian world that there is a realm beyond the visible, and that those who walk with him will eventually dwell with him. This teaches us that the goal of our spiritual walk is not just a long life on earth, but an eternal transition into the presence of the King. Finally, the fact that Enoch's total years match the days of a solar year, 365, carries a spiritual meaning of wholeness. Although he lived the shortest life in the genealogy, he lived the most complete life. Spiritually, this tells us that the measure of a life is not its duration, but its direction. A life lived in the presence of God is a full life, no matter when it ends. Enoch's absence from the world was a testimony to his presence with God. He serves as a spiritual lighthouse for every generation, reminding us that the ultimate purpose of being human is to walk so closely with our Creator that the transition from this world to the next is simply the continuation of a long and beautiful walk. Genesis chapter 5, verses 25 through 27. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. After he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years, and then he died. Historical context. To understand the era of Methuselah in the 15th century BC, we have to look at the concept of the living archive. In ancient Near Eastern tribal cultures, history wasn't kept in libraries. It was kept in the memories of the oldest living members. Methuselah, living for 969 years, served as the ultimate historical bridge for the human race. Now, historically, his lifespan allowed him to be a contemporary of almost every major figure of the antediluvian world. He overlapped with Adam for over 240 years and was still alive to see the birth of Noah. This created a unique historical situation where the eyewitness account of the Garden of Eden and the fall was only one person away from the generation that would enter the ark. For an ancient listener, Methuselah was the physical guarantee that the original truth of God hadn't been distorted by time. The name Methuselah itself, Metushelach, is a fascinating historical study in Semitic prophecy. While man of the javelin is a literal translation, many ancient scholars in the 15th century BC would have recognized the root mut, death, and shalach, to send forth. This led to the historical tradition that his name was a chronological prophecy. If you track the years provided in the Masoretic text, Methuselah dies in the year 1656 from creation, the exact year the flood begins. Historically, this made Methuselah a living countdown for the entire world. Every year he aged, the world was reminded that the sending forth of judgment was one step closer. His life was the historical buffer between God's patience and the coming cataclysm. Compared to the Sumerian king list, where pre-flood figures like Enmenluana were said to reign for 43,200 years, Methuselah's 969 years represent a historically grounded version of longevity. While the Sumerians inflated their kings to the status of immortal demigods, the author of Genesis presents Methuselah as a man who, despite his immense vitality, is still subject to the biological realities of the fall. Historically, this served as a major theological correction for the Israelites. It showed that even the longest-lived, most venerable ancestor was not a god. In a world where the 15th century BC empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia were obsessed with achieving immortality through monuments and magic. The story of Methuselah was a blunt historical reminder that only Yahweh is eternal. The social structure of the 15th century BC also gives us insight into Methuselah's role as a grand patriarch. In a lineage-based society, the oldest living male held absolute authority as the head of the family or tribe. Methuselah's extreme age would have made him the supreme judicial and spiritual authority for nearly a millennium. Historically, this period represents the High Patriarchate, where a single man's wisdom could govern the development of multiple branches of the human family. He would have been the one to officiate the marriages and settle the disputes of hundreds, if not thousands, of other sons and daughters. His death marks more than just the end of a long life. It marks the historical collapse of the old order, clearing the way for the total destruction of the world he had watched grow for 9 centuries. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 25, the focus is on the birth of the 9th generation. At 187 years, Methuselah becomes the father of Lamech. The name Methuselah in Hebrew is Metushelach, a compound of mut, man or death, and shelach, a missile, dart, or ascending forth. Literarily, how the text maintains the exact rhythmic pattern established at the start of the chapter. Age of fatherhood, name of son, remaining years, and total age. However, there is a literal slowing of the generational pace. By fathering a son at 187, Methuselah represents a significant shift compared to the earlier patriarchs who fathered heirs between the ages of 65 and 105. Genesis chapter 5 verse 27 records the highest numerical value for a human life in the Bible: 969 years. The literal construction of the numbers in Hebrew emphasizes the fullness of his days before the end comes. Despite this record-breaking vitality, the verse concludes with the word Vayamot, and he died. Literarily, this is a profound statement of finality. No matter how many centuries Methuselah accumulated, he could not breach the literal barrier of 1,000 years, often referred to in biblical thought as the day of the Lord. The text uses his death to show that even the longest-lived man in history remained subject to the physical decay initiated in Eden. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual significance of Methuselah's life is found in the patience of God. If his name truly signifies that his death would trigger a sending forth of judgment, then every year he lived was a spiritual extension of mercy. Spiritually, Methuselah is a living bridge of grace. The fact that the oldest man in history died in the same year as the flood teaches us that God is not slow in keeping his promise, but patient. His longevity was a spiritual buffer, giving the world nearly a millennium to see the witness of the patriarchs and turn back before the waters were released. There is also a somber spiritual lesson regarding the insufficiency of duration. Methuselah lived longer than any other human, yet the text says nothing about him walking with God as it did for his father, Enoch. This teaches us that in the economy of the spirit, years do not equal depth. You can occupy the earth for 9 centuries and still end in the dust, Vayamot, or you can walk with God for a shorter time and enter eternity. Methuselah's life reminds us that the goal of our existence is not to see how many years we can accumulate, but to ensure our life is aligned with the Creator before the clock runs out. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 5 verse 28, Now the record reaches the final generation of the pre-flood world. Lamech, at age 182, has a son. This is the latest start to fatherhood recorded in the chapter so far, signaling a literal stretching of the timeline. In verse 29, Lamech gives the boy a name and a formal explanation. He calls him Noah. The Hebrew name is Noach, which comes from the root nuach, meaning to rest or to settle down. Lamech follows this with a literal wordplay, saying, "He will comfort us," using the Hebrew verb nacham. Literally, the text is intentionally pairing rest with comfort. Lamech specifically mentions the itzavon, painful toil, and the adamah, ground, which are direct linguistic echoes of the curse in Genesis chapter 3. This creates a literal bookend to the first era of history, showing that the physical struggle for survival remains the primary concern for the 10th generation. Genesis chapter 5 verse 31 records Lamech's total years as 777, followed by the final vayamot, and he died, of the chapter. In verse 32, the rigid, repetitive formula that has dominated the entire chapter finally breaks. It does not record Noah's death. Instead, it notes that after 500 years, Noah became the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This 500-year gap before fatherhood is the longest in the genealogy, literally suggesting that Noah's life was being held or slowed down for a specific divine purpose. The sudden shift from a single heir to 3 sons marks the literal end of the genealogy and prepares the text for the global narrative that follows. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual meaning of Genesis chapter 5 verse 29 is found in the persistence of hope under the weight of the curse. After 9 generations of thorns and thistles, Lamech is spiritually exhausted. By naming his son Rest, he is performing a prophetic act. He is looking for someone to break the cycle of toil and death. Spiritually, Noah acts as a type or a shadow of the Messiah, the one who comes to bring true comfort and rest to those laboring under the consequences of sin. This teaches us that the ultimate goal of human history is not just survival, but the discovery of a Sabbath that can only be provided by God. The age of Lamech, at 777 years, carries a profound spiritual symbolism. In biblical thought, the number 7 represents divine perfection or completion. 777 suggests that the world that was has reached its absolute limit of perfection and corruption simultaneously. It is the spiritual signal that the era of the patriarchs is finished. Meanwhile, Noah's long wait of 500 years before fathering children teaches a lesson in spiritual patience. While the rest of the world was expanding rapidly, other sons and daughters, Noah was being set apart. This represents the concept of the remnant, the few who are preserved by God to carry the promise through a coming judgment. Finally, the shift to 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, signals a spiritual expansion. While the genealogy was a narrow line focused on the seed, the story is now broadening to include the nations. Spiritually, this indicates that the comfort Lamech prayed for would eventually be a blessing for the entire human race. The chapter ends not with a funeral, but with the birth of a new beginning, teaching us that even when God is about to judge the world, He is already planting the seeds of its future restoration.